The Boeing 777 shuddered violently at 37,000 feet over the North Atlantic, and that's when Captain Marcus Holbrook made the announcement that would change everything. His voice crackled through the cabin speakers with an urgency that cut through the drowsy murmur of 200 passengers halfway between London and New York. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I need to ask an unusual question. If there are any military pilots aboard, particularly anyone with fighter jet experience, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately." In row 9, window seat, a woman in her mid-30s stirred beneath a worn leather jacket that served as her blanket. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that revealed nothing about who she was or what she'd done. The flight attendant rushing past didn't even glance at her as she continued toward the cockpit, assuming like everyone else that if help existed on this flight, it would come from someone who looked the part. The woman's eyes opened slowly, revealing irises the color of storm clouds. She'd been dreaming of desert skis and the weight of a flight stick in her hand, the same dream that had haunted her for 3 years since she'd walked away from it all. Her name was Lieutenant Colonel Valentina Viper Kozlova, though nobody on this flight would have guessed that the quiet woman who'd politely declined the meal service had once commanded a squadron of F-22 Raptors in the most classified operations of the past decade. The aircraft lurched again, this time accompanied by a grinding sound that made several passengers gasp. Through her window, Kozlova could see the right engine's cowling vibrating in a way that immediately told her this wasn't ordinary turbulence. Her trained eye caught the subtle trail of fluid streaming from beneath the wing, hydraulic fluid, most likely, and her mind automatically began calculating scenarios. A businessman across the aisle was already standing, straightening his tie as he prepared to announce his credentials. "I flew Cessnas for 15 years, he began loudly, but Kozlova had stopped listening. She was watching the flight attendants' faces, reading the micro-expressions that told her this situation was far worse than the captain was letting on. The lead attendant's hands were trembling as she spoke rapidly into the intercom, and Kozlova caught fragments. Both pilots, incapacitated. Automation failing. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision. 3 years ago, she'd sworn never to fly again after Kandahar, after what the investigation had called an unavoidable tragedy, but what she knew was her failure. The ghosts of that day lived in her peripheral vision, in every reflection of glass, in every distant rumble that might have been jet engines or might have been thunder. The businessman was still talking, now joined by two others who claimed various levels of civilian flying experience, their voices rising in competition. The cabin had erupted into nervous chatter, phones appearing despite regulations, passengers beginning to sense that something was terribly wrong. Through it all, Kozlova remained still, her breathing steady, her fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of challenge coins in her jacket pocket, mementos from a life she'd tried to leave behind. Another violent shake, and this time the oxygen masks dropped. The yellow plastic dangled like surrender flags in the pressurized cabin, and suddenly everyone was screaming. The businessman sat down hard, his face pale, his bravado evaporating. The flight attendant was openly crying now as she tried to maintain order, her training battling against her terror. Kozlova's hand found the worn metal of her most precious coin, the one from her first combat mission, the one her weapons systems officer had given her before he died in the crash that ended everything. She could hear his voice in her memory, clear as the day he'd said it. "Viper, when the world goes sideways, you're the one who flies straight." She unbuckled her seatbelt with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made peace with a decision. Standing, she moved through the chaos with the fluid grace of a predator, her entire demeanor shifting from invisible passenger to something altogether different. Passengers instinctively moved aside as she approached the lead flight attendant, who was attempting to demonstrate oxygen mask usage with shaking hands. "Ma'am," Kozlova said, her voice cutting through the panic with military precision. The flight attendant turned, mascara streaking down her cheeks, and found herself looking into eyes that belonged to someone who had seen worse than this and survived. Lieutenant Colonel Valentina Kozlova, United States Air Force, 7,000 flight hours in fighter aircraft, qualified on commercial aviation systems through military transport certification. She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "I need you to take me to the cockpit immediately." The flight attendant's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around them, passengers had begun to notice the interaction, the quiet authority radiating from the woman in row 9, creating a bubble of stillness in the chaos. The businessman who had been so eager to volunteer was now staring at her with a mixture of relief and shame. But you didn't say anything when the captain asked," the flight attendant stammered. Kozlova's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The captain asked if there were any pilots aboard. He didn't ask if there were any who could actually save this aircraft. She glanced at the cockpit door, calculating. "We have approximately 12 minutes before the hydraulic system completely fails. After that, we're a flying brick. I can explain the technical details, or you can take me to what's left of your flight crew. Choose quickly." The transformation was complete. The woman who had been sleeping in row 9 was gone, replaced by someone who had earned her call sign in the skis over 3 continents, who had been shot at by surface-to-air missiles and lived to tell about it, who had landed an F-22 with half its control surfaces blown off. But underneath the professional exterior, her hands were steady for a different reason. She was terrified, not of dying, but of failing again. The flight attendant nodded frantically and turned toward the cockpit. As Kozlova followed, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the galley mirror. For just a moment, she saw herself as she had been 3 years ago, younger, unbroken, certain of her place in the world. That woman was gone, but perhaps what remained would be enough. The cockpit door loomed ahead, and beyond it, either redemption or confirmation that some failures follow you forever. As her hand reached for the handle, she heard the voice of every instructor she'd ever had, every wingman who'd trusted her with their life, every superior who'd pinned another medal on her chest. They all said the same thing: fly the plane. She was about to find out if she still could. The cockpit door opened to reveal a scene from her nightmares. Captain Holbrook was slumped forward in his seat, unconscious, an oxygen mask hanging uselessly beside his face. The first officer was conscious but barely, his face gray with hypoxia, fumbling with controls he could no longer properly see. The instrument panel was a Christmas tree of warning lights, red and amber competing for attention in a symphony of system failures that would have challenged a fully functional crew. Kozlova moved without hesitation, muscle memory overriding 3 years of dormancy. She pulled the captain from his seat with surprising strength, laying him carefully in the space behind the cockpit as the lead flight attendant rushed to tend to him. The first officer tried to speak, but she was already sliding into the captain's seat, her hands moving across the controls with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent more time in cockpits than most people spend in their own homes. "First officer," she glanced at his nameplate, "Morrison, I'm taking command of this aircraft. Can you remain conscious enough to assist, or do I need to fly solo?" Morrison's eyes widened as he watched her fingers dance across the overhead panel, isolating damaged systems with a speed that spoke of intimate familiarity with aviation architecture. Who are you?" "Someone who's going to get us on the ground," she replied, already scanning the navigation display. "We're 400 miles from the nearest suitable runway, Shannon Airport, Ireland. The right engine is failing, hydraulics are compromised, and based on these readings, we have an uncontained turbine failure that's probably severed multiple control runs." She pulled on the captain's headset. "Shannon Control, this is." She paused, checking the flight number. United Airlines 447, declaring an emergency. "We have dual pilot incapacitation and catastrophic system failures. Requesting immediate vectors for approach, all runways to be cleared." The voice that came back was startled but professional. United 447, Shannon Control. Confirm you have qualified personnel at the controls. For the first time in 3 years, Kozlova allowed herself a grim smile. Shannon Control, you have Lieutenant Colonel Kozlova at the controls. 7,000 hours multi-engine jet time. We're going to need the longest runway you've got and every emergency vehicle on the field. She adjusted the throttles, feeling the wounded aircraft respond sluggishly. And Control, you might want to notify command that Viper is flying again. There was a pause on the other end then. Viper, Colonel, is that really you? This is Captain O'Brien. We flew joint exercises in 2019. Small world, O'Brien. Save the reunion for when I've got this bird on the ground. Right now, I need you to clear everything in a 50-mile radius. This is going to get sporty. Morrison was staring at her with something approaching awe. Viper, you're the Viper, the one who's trying to save 200 lives. She cut him off. Can you handle the radio while I fly or not? He nodded quickly, taking over communications as Kozlova focused on the impossible task of keeping the dying aircraft aloft. Every instinct she'd honed over 2 decades of flying was screaming at her. The 777 was sluggish, responding to inputs with a delay that would be fatal if she miscalculated. The right engine was producing barely 30% thrust, and every few seconds, the aircraft would shudder as another system failed. Through the cockpit door, she could hear the flight attendants trying to prepare the passengers for an emergency landing. Someone was praying loudly in Spanish. A child was crying. These sounds should have distracted her, but instead, they sharpened her focus. These weren't statistics or tactical assessments. These were people who would live or die based on decisions she made in the next 10 minutes. Viper, Morrison said quietly, the hydraulics just hit critical. We're losing the ability to lower the landing gear. She'd anticipated this. We'll use the gravity drop. It's in the manual, page 447 of the emergency procedures. The irony isn't lost on me. Her fingers found the manual override panel. But first, we need to descend to 10,000 feet and slow to minimum controllable airspeed. The gear doors will need to be forced open against the airstream. That's never been successfully done on a 777 in flight. First time for everything. She banked the aircraft gently, feeling the frame groan in protest. Through her window, the Irish coast was visible in the distance, a line of green against gray water. O'Brien, this is Viper. I need you to calculate minimum controllable airspeed for a 777 at current weight with partial hydraulic failure, and I need it yesterday. Already on it, Viper. Your reputation precedes you. Minimum controllable is going to be approximately 145 knots at your current weight, but that's theoretical. No one's ever. Understood. Morrison, I need you to start reading the gravity drop checklist. We'll have one shot at this. As she began the descent, fighting the aircraft every foot of the way, Kozlova found herself thinking about Kandahar again, about the decision that had haunted her for 3 years. She'd been leading a strike package against a high-value target when intelligence had come through about civilians in the compound. The abort order had come too late. Her wingman, Captain David Chen, had already released his ordnance. In the split second she'd had to decide, she'd chosen to protect her wingman from the psychological burden, taking responsibility for the strike herself. The investigation had cleared her of wrongdoing. The intelligence had been flawed, the civilians had been human shields, the strike had been legally justified. But Chen had never flown again, consumed by guilt. And Kozlova had walked away from the Air Force, from flying, from everything that had defined her, because she couldn't shake the feeling that a better pilot would have found another way. Now, 3 years later, she was being asked to be that better pilot. 10,000 feet, Morrison announced, beginning gravity drop sequence. The landing gear manual release was located beneath a panel that required significant force to open. Kozlova pulled hard, feeling something in her shoulder pop, an old injury from an ejection over Syria acting up. The panel came free, revealing a series of manual cranks that looked absurdly primitive in the high-tech cockpit. Morrison, take the controls. Hold her steady at 145 knots. Don't let her drop below that or we'll stall. Don't go above 150 or the gear doors won't open. Morrison's face was white as he took the control yoke. I've never. You have now. She was already turning the crank, counting rotations. The manual said 50 turns to release the uplocks. Her shoulders screamed as she worked, the mechanism fighting her every turn. At 30 turns, she heard a loud bang from below. The nose gear door had partially opened. Airspeed dropping, Morrison called out. 142 knots. Hold it, she cranked faster, sweat beading on her forehead. 40 turns. 45. At 50, there was a tremendous shudder and 3 green lights appeared on the panel. The landing gear was down and locked. She slid back into the captain's seat, taking control as Morrison collapsed back, exhausted from the effort of maintaining such precise control. Shannon control, Viper. We have 3 green, gear down and locked. Requesting straighten approach runway 24. Roger, Viper. You're cleared for any approach you need. Emergency vehicles are standing by. The entire field is yours. Through the windscreen, Shannon Airport was visible now, a concrete lifeline in a sea of green fields. But Kozlova knew the hardest part was yet to come. Landing a partially controllable 777 with failing engines and compromised hydraulics would require every skill she'd ever learned, and several she'd have to invent on the spot. Morrison, I need you to handle the throttles. When I call for power changes, make them immediately but smoothly. Jerky movements will cause us to depart controlled flight. Understood. She began configuring for landing, each switch and lever a prayer to the gods of aviation. The flaps deployed asymmetrically, causing the aircraft to roll left. She corrected with rudder, but the response was sluggish. They were flying on the edge of disaster, and everyone in the cockpit knew it. 5 miles out, she announced, both for Morrison and for the passengers who were no doubt listening to every word. Speed 180 knots, descending through 2,000 feet. The airport grew larger in the windscreen. She could see the emergency vehicles lining the runway, their lights flashing in anticipation. The crosswind was gusting to 15 knots, which would have been challenging in a fully functional aircraft. In their current state, it was nearly impossible. Viper, O'Brien's voice came through the headset, be advised, wind shear alert on final. Recommend you add 10 knots to approach speed. She'd already felt it, the invisible hand trying to push them off course. Copy, adding 10. She glanced at Morrison. When we touch down, I'll need maximum reverse thrust on the left engine only. The right engine won't survive it. Be ready with the brakes, but not until I call for them. If we brake too early with this crosswind, we'll ground loop. The runway threshold passed beneath them. Kozlova pulled the throttles to idle, feeling the aircraft sink. The automated callouts began, 50, 40, 30, 2010. The main gear touched down hard, bouncing once before settling. She held the nose up as long as possible, bleeding off speed, then lowered it gently to the runway. Reverse thrust now. Morrison slammed the thrust reverser lever back. The aircraft yawed violently to the left as the asymmetric thrust took effect. Kozlova fought it with rudder, her leg muscles straining against the pedals. The end of the runway was approaching fast, too fast. Brakes, she commanded, and Morrison applied them smoothly. The aircraft shuddered, tires smoking, but it was slowing. 300 meters from the end of the runway, they came to a stop. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then the cockpit erupted in cheers from the flight attendants who had crowded in to watch. Morrison was crying openly. From the cabin came the sound of applause, growing from scattered clapping to a thunderous ovation. Kozlova sat back in the seat, her hands finally beginning to shake. She keyed the intercom one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Shannon. On behalf of the entire crew, Thank you for your patience. Emergency services will be boarding shortly to assist with evacuation." She pulled off the headset and found Morrison staring at her with undisguised admiration. "How?" he asked simply. "Training," she replied, but that wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that for 3 years she'd been running from the pilot she'd been, the warrior who'd made impossible decisions in impossible situations. Today, she'd stopped running. O'Brien's voice crackled over the radio. "Viper, magnificent flying. The whole world's going to know about this." But Kozlova was already unbuckling, preparing to leave the cockpit. She had no interest in being a hero. Heroes didn't make the mistakes she'd made. Heroes didn't carry the ghosts she carried. She was just a pilot who had been in row 9 when the universe decided to test her one more time. As she stood to leave, Morrison grabbed her arm gently. "Colonel, wait. I need to know something. They say you walked away from flying after Kandahar, that you blamed yourself for something that wasn't your fault. Why come back now?" She looked at him, this young first officer who would probably fly for another 30 years, who would tell this story countless times, who would remember this day whenever he faced his own impossible decisions. "Because sleeping passengers don't get to choose their moments, Morrison. When the captain asks if anyone can fly, you either step up or live with the consequences. I've lived with consequences for 3 years. Today, I chose to fly." She left the cockpit to find the cabin in organized chaos. Emergency slides were deployed, and passengers were evacuating in orderly fashion. The flight attendants had taken control, their training overcoming their earlier panic. As she moved toward an exit, passengers began recognizing her, some reaching out to touch her arm, others simply nodding with tear-filled eyes. Near the exit, the businessman from across the aisle stood with his family. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then simply extended his hand. She shook it once, firmly, and continued past. There would be time for gratitude later, endless debriefs and investigations, and probably media attention she didn't want. But right now, she needed to get off this aircraft and find somewhere quiet to process what had just happened. As she reached the emergency slide, the lead flight attendant appeared beside her. "Colonel, I—" "Just another passenger," Kozlova interrupted gently. "Just someone who was sleeping in row 9. She sat on the slide and pushed off, descending to the tarmac where emergency personnel were waiting. The Irish rain had started, a soft mist that felt like baptism after the recycled air of the cockpit. She walked away from the aircraft, not looking back, her leather jacket pulled tight against the weather. Behind her, she could hear O'Brien on someone's radio, already telling the story. You should have seen it. 300 souls saved by a pilot who wasn't even supposed to be flying anymore. She just appeared out of nowhere, like she was waiting for this moment. But Kozlova knew better. She hadn't been waiting for this moment, she'd been running from it. Running from the responsibility, the weight of other people's lives, the terrible clarity that came with making decisions at 30,000 feet. Today, the universe had simply decided she'd run far enough. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to find dozens of messages already flooding in. News traveled fast in the aviation community. One message stood out, from a number she hadn't seen in 3 years. David Chen, her former wingman, the one who'd never flown again after Kandahar. "Saw the news, knew it had to be you. You saved them all, Val. Maybe it's time we both stopped running." She stared at the message for a long moment, rain dripping from her hair onto the screen. Around her, the organized chaos of the emergency response continued. Passengers were being loaded onto buses, their adventure over, their lives continuing thanks to a woman they'd never noticed sleeping in row 9. Tomorrow, there would be interviews and investigations. The media would want to know everything about the mysterious lieutenant colonel who had emerged from anonymity to perform what they were already calling the miracle at Shannon. They'd dig into her past, find out about Kandahar, about the investigation, about why one of the Air Force's most decorated pilots had walked away from everything. But today, standing in the Irish rain, watching the 777 being surrounded by emergency vehicles, Kozlova made a decision. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a number she'd never deleted but never called. General Patricia Hayes, her former commanding officer, the woman who'd tried for months to convince her not to resign her commission. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Val, is that really you?" "Pat," Kozlova said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "I just landed a broken 777 in Shannon. I think I'm ready to come home." There was silence on the other end then. "Your wings have been waiting for you, Colonel. They always have been." As she ended the call, Kozlova turned to look back at the aircraft one last time. The emergency slides looked like yellow tongues extended in exhaustion. The right engine was still smoking slightly. It should have been impossible to land in that condition, but impossible was just another word for untested. A paramedic approached her with a blanket and a gentle smile. "Ma'am, we need to check you over. Standard procedure after an incident like this." She nodded, allowing herself to be led to a medical tent. As they walked, the paramedic couldn't help himself. "That was extraordinary flying. How did you know what to do?" Kozlova considered the question. How did she explain that every emergency procedure, every instinct, every hard-won lesson from 20 years of flying had crystallized in those crucial minutes? How did she describe the weight of 200 lives balanced against the ghost of past failures? How did she convey that sometimes redemption comes not from forgetting our mistakes, but from being ready when the universe offers a second chance? "I was trained by the best," she said simply, "and I had the best reasons to succeed." The paramedic nodded as if this explained everything. Perhaps it did. As they reached the medical tent, Kozlova saw her reflection in the glass door. She looked older than she had 3 years ago, worn by the weight of carrying guilt that perhaps had never been hers to carry. But there was something else there too, a spark that had been missing, the light of someone who had remembered who they were. Inside the tent, other passengers were being treated for minor injuries from the evacuation. They looked up as she entered, recognition dawning on their faces. An elderly woman reached out and squeezed her hand. A young father with his daughter on his lap mouthed, "Thank you." The businessman from earlier was there too, a bandage on his forehead from the evacuation. He stood up straight, and in a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, he saluted. It was wrong, of course. Civilians didn't salute, and she wasn't in uniform. But Kozlova found herself returning it anyway, a crisp military acknowledgement that transcended protocol. Because sometimes honor isn't about regulations or rank or even being right. Sometimes it's about recognizing the moment when someone chooses to be more than their fears. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical checks, preliminary statements to investigators, and avoiding the growing media presence. The story was already going viral, helped by passenger videos and O'Brien's colorful radio commentary. But Kozlova managed to slip away before the cameras could find her, catching a ride with a sympathetic Irish police officer who understood that heroes sometimes needed space to breathe. She found herself at a small pub on the outskirts of Shannon town, nursing a Guinness and watching the news coverage on a television above the bar. They were calling it the Miracle at Shannon now, complete with dramatic recreations and aviation experts explaining why what she'd done should have been impossible. "You're her, aren't you?" the bartender asked quietly, refilling her glass without being asked. "The pilot from the news." Kozlova considered denying it, maintaining the anonymity she'd cultivated for 3 years. But something had changed in those minutes above the Atlantic. She'd remembered that hiding from who you were meant hiding from who you could be. "I was the pilot," she admitted. The bartender nodded, then did something unexpected. He reached under the bar and pulled out a dusty bottle of Irish whiskey, the kind reserved for special occasions. He poured 2 glasses, raising one in a toast. "To coming back from the dead," he said. "Sometimes that's the bravest thing of all." They drank in companionable silence, and Kozlova felt something inside her finally unclench. For 3 years, she'd been holding her breath, waiting for judgment or absolution or some sign that she deserved to fly again. She'd never considered that maybe deserving had nothing to do with it. Maybe it was simply about being ready when the moment came. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Morrison, the first officer. "Colonel, thought you should know, Captain Holbrook is conscious and stable. He wants to thank you personally. Also, United Airlines CEO is here asking about you. Lots of talk about commendations and job offers. Should I tell them where you are?" She typed back, "Tell them I was just a passenger in row 9. Tell them I've gone home." But even as she sent it, she knew it wasn't true. She hadn't gone home. She was finally heading there. General Hayes had already sent follow-up messages about reinstatement procedures, about a new squadron that needed a commander, about how the Air Force had never really accepted her resignation anyway, just put it in a drawer and waited. Chen had messaged again too. "I started flying again 6 months ago, civilian medical transports, saving lives instead of the other thing. Maybe we both needed to find our way back differently." Outside the pub, the Irish evening was settling into night. Somewhere above, aircraft were tracing their paths across the Atlantic, their passengers never knowing how close disaster could be or how thin the line between routine and catastrophe. In row 9 of some other flight, another quiet passenger was perhaps carrying their own burden, their own secret capability, waiting for their moment to choose between stepping forward and staying hidden. Kozlova finished her drink and left euros on the bar, nodding to the bartender who understood without words that some stories were better left incomplete. Outside, she called for a taxi to Dublin Airport. She had a flight to catch, commercial this time, hopefully less eventful. But she'd be watching the crew, old habits already reasserting themselves, the warrior's instinct to protect never really gone, just dormant. As the taxi pulled up, her phone rang. General Hayes again. "Val, I've been thinking. That squadron I mentioned, it's not combat. It's training. The next generation of pilots who need to learn not just how to fly, but when to fly and when to walk away. They need someone who understands both, someone who's been broken and found a way to be whole again." Kozlova smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in 3 years. "Send me the details. Pat, turns out sleeping in row 9 was just a layover. I'm ready to come home." The taxi drove through the Irish countryside toward Dublin, past fields that looked silver in the moonlight. In the distance, she could see aircraft lights blinking their way across the sky, each one carrying stories, possibilities, moments of truth waiting to unfold. She'd been one of those stories today, but tomorrow she'd be something more. A teacher, a guide, someone who could tell young pilots that sometimes the most important thing you could do was walk away, and sometimes the most important thing was to walk back. Her reflection in the taxi window showed a woman transformed not by the day's heroics, but by the simple act of choosing to be herself again. The call sign Viper had been earned in combat, in split-second decisions and impossible odds. But perhaps it meant something different now. Perhaps it meant someone who could strike when necessary but also knew when to remain coiled, waiting, watching, ready. The news was still playing on the taxi's radio, the story growing with each telling. They'd found her service record now, the medals and commendations, the combat missions and the investigation after Kandahar. They were painting her as a tragic hero returned to glory, a narrative that sold newspapers and clicked links but missed the essential truth. She hadn't been hiding from the world. She'd been hiding from herself. By the time she reached Dublin Airport, she'd made 3 decisions. First, she would take the training squadron position, but on her terms, teaching not just tactics and procedures but the harder lessons about moral injury and recovery. Second, she would reach out to Chen and the others from Kandahar, the ones who'd carried their own guilt in silence. And third, she would stop running from the pilot she'd been and start becoming the pilot she was meant to be. The airport was busy despite the late hour, travelers moving with purpose toward their gates. She found herself studying them differently now, wondering who among them carried hidden capabilities, who might be the next person to step forward when the impossible became necessary. The mother juggling 3 children might be a former surgeon. The businessman absorbed in his laptop might be a retired firefighter. The elderly couple might have stories of their own about moments when ordinary people became extraordinary. At the gate for her flight back to London and then on to Washington, she was recognized by the gate agent, who upgraded her to first class without asking. She accepted graciously, understanding that this was part of it now. The visibility, the recognition, the weight of being known for a single moment that defined nothing and everything about who she was. As she settled into her seat, 1A this time, not row 9, she pulled out her phone to find one more message, this one from an unknown number. Colonel Kozlova, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a 777 captain for American Airlines. I've flown that approach into Shannon 100 times in perfect conditions and still found it challenging. What you did today, it's going to be taught in flight schools for generations, but I wanted you to know something else. My daughter is a cadet at the Air Force Academy. She's brilliant, talented, and 2 weeks ago she was ready to quit because she made a mistake in a flight simulator that would have killed everyone aboard. I told her about you, about Kandahar, about how you walked away and came back. She's decided to stay. Sometimes the best pilots aren't the ones who never fail. They're the ones who fail and choose to fly again. Thank you for showing us that. Kozlova read the message twice, then saved it. In all the noise about heroism and miracles, this felt like the truth she'd been searching for. She hadn't saved 200 lives today because she was exceptional. She'd saved them because she'd learned from failure, carried it, been shaped by it, and ultimately chosen to transcend it. The flight began boarding, and she found herself watching the pilots do their pre-flight walk around through the window. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking surfaces and systems, the guardians of routine that kept disaster at bay. She knew that tomorrow or next week or next year, she'd be back in uniform, teaching young pilots these same procedures. But she'd also teach them something more. That courage wasn't the absence of fear or failure but the decision to fly despite them. Her phone buzzed one last time. Chen again. The investigation board wants to reopen Kandahar. Full exoneration, public vindication. They're saying what we always knew. We made the best decision with the information we had. She typed back, let them, but it doesn't change anything. We know what we know. The only vindication that matters is continuing to serve. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Kozlova closed her eyes and let herself remember all of it. The good flights and the bad ones, the saves and the losses, the weight of command and the freedom of walking away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new moments of truth. But tonight, she was just another passenger, heading home after an unexpected detour, carrying nothing more than a leather jacket and the knowledge that sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you need to be. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, professional and reassuring, running through the standard safety briefing. When he reached the part about, in the unlikely event of an emergency, Kozlova found herself smiling. Because emergencies weren't unlikely, they were inevitable. The only question was whether you'd be ready when they came. As the aircraft lifted off into the night sky, she thought about all the passengers in all the row 9s of all the flights crossing the globe at this moment. Each one a potential story, a possible hero, a hidden capability waiting for its moment. Most would never be called upon. Most would land safely, collect their luggage, and continue with their lives never knowing how close they'd come to needing someone extraordinary. But some would face their moment, as she had faced hers. And in that moment, they would discover what she had learned in the skis over Shannon, that we are all more capable than we believe, that our failures don't define us but refine us, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to be who we truly are when the world needs us most. The aircraft climbed through 37,000 feet, the same altitude where everything had gone wrong earlier that day. Kozlova felt no anxiety, no flashback to the crisis. Instead, she felt a profound sense of